For those of you I may not have met yet, my name is Bo Gebbe. I'm Vice President at Evolving Solutions. Been at the company for a little over 3.5 years, and I am very pleased to welcome Matt Eastwood, our guest speaker for today. And I will get to Matt's formal introduction and background here in just a couple of minutes. If we want to go to the next slide, for those of you that may be new or newer to Evolving Solutions, just a little bit of information about us. We're a technology solutions provider based in the Midwest, but work with clients throughout the country and throughout the world, really focusing on modernization and automation of mission-critical applications and infrastructure. We're all about business transformation. And, you know, in the past, so many things that you heard around tech was how do we cut costs? We are really focused on how do we help our clients transform to help grow the business and drive top-line revenue. And that's what our team is missioned with every day. We focus on modern operations is really our core and our niche. And so the whole premise of, you know, we all have to support our legacy or our core businesses. At the same time, we have to innovate and support next-gen workloads. It's not like we're getting double the budget or double the staff to do that. So how do we modernize operations to be able to support the old and the new and support the needs of the business and do it quicker and in a more agile fashion, especially with everything that we're facing in the world today. Matt, if you want to go to the next slide. And we deliver that through what we call our hybrid cloud vision. Our premise is, you know, cloud is not a place, cloud is a set of disciplines. So whether your data resides on-prem, in a hosted facility, in a public cloud facility, and everywhere in between, you know, we really focus on, at the base of this, modern platforms into what I mentioned there, modern operations, modern development for our, you know, our application development colleagues and teams. And at the end of the day, none of this matters unless you have people, process, governance, and structure, and unless you're driving business value and that, you know, helping that business grow. So this is really our blueprint for how we see the world. I think it'll set up the conversation very nicely for what Matt talks about today. You know, we still see an immense need for on-premise infrastructure and applications. However, you know, and we see a huge need as well as public cloud capacity utilization grows. How do you merge the two worlds, and how do you have that cloud-like experience no matter where the data resides? So Matt's going to talk a little bit today about what he sees in the world, what he's hearing from clients and other analysts, and just give us some thoughts, especially in this time of transition that we're all facing. So, you know, I'll go to the next slide here and I'll formally introduce Matt. And I will say, as you go throughout the session today, if you have questions, we're going to try and save a few minutes at the end. Feel free to put those into the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. And if we don't get to the question, we'll try and follow up by email afterwards. So I'd like to welcome Matt Eastwood. Matt is Senior Vice President of IDC's Enterprise Infrastructure, Infrastructure Software, Infrastructure Services, Cloud Developer, and Alliances Research Groups. I would love to see Matt's business card with his full title on there. But Matt's responsibilities include managing a team of analysts researching people, process, and technology trends affecting enterprise computing, storage, networking, systems infrastructure, software, infrastructure services, cloud, data center, developers, channels, and alliances. He draws upon his experience as an environmental engineer, as a participant in IDC's corporate and social responsibility and technology for social good research initiative. And Matt also leads IDC's Buyer View syndicated primary research, which is focused on emerging trends in cloud, developers, security providers, artificial intelligence, and security. So Matt, thank you for being here, and we appreciate your time, and look forward to hearing what you have to say today.
All right, great, and thank you, Bill. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Perfect.
sir.
And thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And yeah, it's a little bit much when you start to get into all the details around what the team does. But I want to thank you, Bo, for having me, and I'm really excited to be part of today's Evolving Solutions event. And I'm going to look at really digital transformation and the impact it's having on infrastructure and its foundational importance to the business. Much like you heard from Bo, we see hybrid and multi-cloud as really the center of an IT transformation going forward. So today, what I'll do is I'll provide a little bit of context around the impact that we've seen both near term and longer term from what happened with COVID and what we're still living through. Many of us still, you know, kind of working remotely. And we'll take a quick review of how this is accelerating the shift towards an increasingly digital business model, And we'll take a look at some of those perspectives that Bo mentioned when he talked about the buyer view that we're hearing from cloud buyers today, and kind of bringing what those perspectives are as you bring those into the marketplace using data that we collect from IT buyers. So what I'd like to do is start off here by just talking a little bit about, as I said, COVID. But before we go there, we see, and we were seeing IT growth rates in the industry that were really roughly running at about 2 times GDP growth before COVID came along. And we'd never seen anything like that in our industry, including back in Y2K and the dot-com boom. And a lot of that was because there was so much focus on transformation, and a lot of that focus was on how we can embrace these new technologies, whether it's cloud, whether it's mobile technologies, whether it's deep, rich analytics, or even social sentiment data, and how that can all be put together to create something quite different for our customers. And really what it comes down to is we saw a lot of investments that were being driven by very innovative use of applications and data to differentiate customers in the marketplace, to improve customer experiences, to really increase the speed and agility that we bring new businesses to market, and also lower cost and risk. So when we saw COVID come along, early in the crisis, IDC realized that this pandemic would very quickly reshape a lot of the IT and business priorities that we had been we had been seeing up until that point. And new challenges were emerging as suppliers and partners were really selling into unknowns. And they were really quickly starting to see some recessionary behaviors as well, which I'll talk to. And we saw a need to really kind of bridge this initial work from home shift into an economic backdrop that would play out across the market over the next few years. So the way we've been internalizing this and telling the story is really through these 5 stages. So, stage 1 was the crisis itself, and that was really what a lot of us were dealing with in, March and April. Not trying to be dismissive of where we are, we're still dealing with this, but that initial, kind of shocked the system of bringing everybody home and driving productivity from a work from home environment was really what we were dealing with the first few months of this. And then we start to see the associated economic impacts. And now clearly this is going to depend on very dramatically based on the industry that folks are in. But we started to see things like cost optimization become a bigger mantra and an objective again, as budgets started to be rethought, as folks were really focused on preserving cash. And then when you move a little bit further out into I guess the second half of 2020 and even the beginning of 2021, we do anticipate somewhat more of a recessionary approach to just how businesses are run. Customers will be adapting to these changing circumstances, and many have begun to take even some cost actions, including reductions in force, and their priorities are really being kind of reoriented as we go through this. But we do believe that we'll come out of this with this focus on a return to growth, as we always do, and we'll see targeted investments again kind of becoming top of mind, and we see this happening in 2021. And then on the other side, we talk about this as the next normal, and slowly but surely we come out of this in a new way. And I think we don't expect that anyone's going to flip a switch and deem this whole thing to be over, but we will see this hybrid model emerge on the other side, which will take some of the best of what we've learned from this work from home experience, this distance learning that kids are going through, and we'll apply it with what was missed. And so even an example would be today when we sit down and have a webinar like this. I mean, we'll continue to see, I think, more remote, kind of outreach with our customers and our partners, but we're going to realize we need to get back together face to face as well, as that's very much part of how we as humans, I think, really like to work. So where are we with all of this today? Well, IDC's been looking at some benchmarking of the shifting that's been happening through this crisis. And in early June, we're really just beginning to see globally a shift from this business continuity focus and into the business continuity focus and away from the crisis focus that was happening, and kind of this cost optimization beginning to become top of mind for a lot of the users. But really the primary takeaway from this visual is what we learned in Asia. So Asia was impacted by the pandemic 6 to 8 weeks earlier than what we saw here in North America or even in Europe. And they're really, I think, a good barometer for what will happen next and how quickly this may actually happen around the world once this virus is contained, and we can start to see the resumption of kind of more traditional kind of business activities. So what we're seeing is about 75% of the pre-COVID IT roadmap, the projects that were on schedule and in place, remaining in place. But the surviving projects will begin to look, not surprisingly, they'll be a bit more focused on projects that offer a quick return to the business. So there's an immediate benefit to the business. They'll provide for a combination of reduced cost and efficiency. They'll generally be a bit more easily completed, a little less complex. They'll come with a little less IT risk, if you will. And we even start to see that in the haste to support that immediate shift to work from home and also to distance learning, that there may have even been some technical debt that was created that needs to be reversed for the long haul. So there might be some cleanup that we need to do because we had to do some things pretty quickly to make this entire, COVID work from home experience work for everyone. So what does it mean? Well, what does it mean? It means that about half the organizations that we're talking to are adding new projects to their agenda. And these projects can be characterized kind of really through three broad kind of notions. One is they will address weakness that was exposed during the pandemic. They'll take advantage of competitor weakness and enable, the share capture in the market. So we've typically seen through kind of recessions, some organizations are much more able to capitalize on some weaknesses that they see around them and act on that. And our counsel as analysts is you really want to invest and innovate in a down cycle. So when you come out of this and the demand climate's kind of back to a healthy pace, you're ready to really take full advantage of that. So we see people also focusing on new innovative business models that will help enable more of this digital transformation, which has become an even bigger priority for businesses as a result of what we've seen from the pandemic. So when we think about some of these investment goals, we're seeing a significant acceleration in digital transformation as a result of all of this. And we know that when we think about something like digital transformation, I like to think of it, just in simple terms as a continuum of applications and data that stretches from the edge to the core. And IDC expects, kind of surprisingly, but over the next 4 years, we expect the number of applications in an enterprise will roughly double. So think of it this way. We'll create as many new applications over the next 4 years as we created over the last 40 years, which is pretty staggering. And then along with that comes the continued rapid growth of data that we have to manage and are really instrumental to a lot of these experiences that we're trying to create. So it's really more critical than ever for businesses to have a digital infrastructure that's scalable and agile. And cloud is changing everything. And as you heard Bo say, we agree. We see cloud not as a destination, but really as an operating model for this business critical IT layer that will really drive businesses forward. So it's really about driving things like security and automation and a rich set of IT operations into the DNA of an IT organization and driving more executive level in the C-suite awareness of how important this infrastructure is to that digital transformation. So in a way, it's saying that we need to kind of get past some of the set it and forget it mentalities that we've traditionally seen businesses think about when they think about their IT infrastructure and think about it as really a strategic area of investment for them. So with that, we think about how we can align with some of the priorities of the CEO. And in this hybrid world, interoperability matters, and it's really important for customers to protect their data anywhere along that edge to core continuum that I mentioned. And as the business value of data rises, protecting these data assets is more critical than ever. And enterprises are looking for cloud solutions that can help them achieve this. And they want to do it in a way that's really aligned with their key workloads. So given the pandemic and this economic crisis that we're dealing with, we're really looking to speak the language of the CEO, and that will be really important because, again, as I said, we want to relate the importance and the strategic value of that infrastructure to what's happening at the business layer in terms of strategy. And so through this, you want to look at this through a number of different lenses, but one would be business events. So everything from crisis management, where they're very focused on things like safety and communications and cash flow. And a lot of us, felt that in the communications we're seeing from our own organizations in March and April and May. And then there's a shift into things like, well, what about business variability and what's that going to mean? And how do we do the financial planning and the workforce rationalization and the risk minimization that we need to do to really deal with how we kind of find the bottom here? And then on the back end, when we think about resiliency, and we think we're moving here pretty quickly, it's about contingency planning, about potentially M&A, divestitures of non-core assets. It's really about kind of positioning the organization to succeed in that those new opportunities that come through in the back end, where we'll see a lot of change management, new business roadmaps, and so forth emerge. So one other way that I think is important too is we have to consider the CIO. And of course, the CIO's job is to connect the needs of the CEO and the C-suite to the technology roadmap and the implementation hierarchy that they want to bring forward. And this is about adjusting roadmaps like we've talked about and some reprioritization of budget. And the initial response was really to just keep everyone and everything moving in this rush to work from home. But as I mentioned earlier, we think that we've seen some examples where there was some additional and maybe unwanted technical debt that was created as a part of that's just the overall response time that was required that needs to be rethought on the back end of all this. So the real focus is really on how we can think about capacity optimization and resiliency through this project lens as we shift the optimization towards the optimization of the people, the processes, and technology. And again, as Bo said when he was introducing the concept of how we should think of cloud, that's very much how I think of cloud in this lens here as well. It's that operating model for the business going forward. Okay, so let's shift gears here and talk just a little bit about some proof points on digital transformation. So at IDC, when we think about digital transformation, it's important to think about the technology, the deployment, and the operations. And I said the people, the process, and the technology. But another way to think about it is where we are with what we've called the third platform. So cloud, mobile, data, and analytics. And we're really seeing the creation of new ecosystems that center on things like AI and IoT and edge and trust that are really being optimized for scale and agility. So essentially what's happening is the technology ecosystems that we knew prior to cloud begin to get reshaped by cloud. So new types of partnerships form between the technology builders, the service providers that are offering some of this as a service, and then all the solutions implementers that live in the world of kind of bringing all this together and delivering it to the marketplace. And ultimately, where we're headed here is we're working towards an era of what we would refer to as autonomy, where we think we'll move towards a much more of a self-managed infrastructure with self-managing networks, because the scale requirements, if you think about what I said about the doubling of applications and data growing 4 or 5x, there's no way that an enterprise will be able to continue to keep up with this using the overall approaches that they had to implementation and operations of an infrastructure that they've known previously. And one way to think about this is we use this notion of multiplied innovation. We tell this ecosystem story that we look at happening across insights and reach, development, expectation, and trust. And the power of the third platform is really in how multiple technologies can come together to power this digital business forward. And as I said, we see this continuum of apps and data that stretches from edge to core, but it's important to think about how and where insights will be chased, will actually look to extract value from that data. And it's also going to see a whole host of explosion, not only in apps, but in new cloud native applications that will reset and refocus some of our expectations around the infrastructure. And connectivity, for example, will really need to be ubiquitous, and trust will be squarely at the center of a lot of what's happening when we think about multiplied innovation. So where are we with product and service delivery when it comes to a digital, perspective? Well, the customers that we're talking to today believe that they're about halfway there. But the complexity of the journey is rising, and we're gone from this, kind of focus on how do we go to a more of a mobile engagement model to something that included the creation of digital twins to something that's much more even sophisticated than that. And we're stretching from the edge to the core of the cloud and everywhere in between. And as we do that, the continuum of apps and data becomes more and more dependent on each other and the business operations that are built on top. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but it's an important notion to think about, is that none of this happens in isolation. That may seem obvious, but it has a really big implications for how you think about landing your applications, where you want to land them, how you want to manage them. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So I loved this quote from Satya Nadella at Microsoft. He said on one of their first earnings call in the middle of this pandemic that, we've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in just 2 months. And it's really succinct, it's powerful, but most importantly to me, it's accurate, because that's really what it did, is it pushed people. For those that were able to, kind of meet the need here, meet the challenge, it was a pressure test for sure. It was a stress test on all the people, but also on all the technologies. But for those that maybe weren't as ready, it really showed a lot of gaps that needed to be plugged pretty quickly. So when we think about this, we see businesses really investing heavily in digital, not surprisingly, and these digital capabilities matter. And as I said earlier, the set it and forget it approach to IT practices are just not enough. So for decades, users really looked to reduce their spend on infrastructure and refocus this revenue, or this budget higher up the stack, mainly in applications and data-informed processes. But the sheer scale of what's coming just won't allow this to happen. As I said, we'll need more agility, we'll need more speed, we'll need the scale to support these apps and data. And the future enterprise will really need to think about benchmarking themselves quite differently. And for what it's worth, we think that customers see that their industries are roughly halfway disrupted today. And this is data from 2019, but we've got data that just came in the last few weeks that looks similar. They believe the level of business transformation ahead is significant. And they may be optimistic. They believe that IT is slightly ahead of the business, but that is exactly where it should be. You cannot wait for the IT to catch up with the business. IT really needs to anticipate the needs of the business and get out in front of some of these transformation requirements. You can't afford to wait around for the business to redefine itself. It's really about working in parallel aggressively to make sure that this core digital infrastructure, this core strategic assets in place and ready for where the business is going. So when we think about business impacts, we know that businesses need to think more like innovators, and IT really needs to support this mission. And it's really great to see the focus on innovation and digital products that were really emerging under business goals. And when we think about that, we also see user expectations, and they're not really changing quite as much as you might think. These expectations have always been high. It continues to come down to the applications and data really being tuned for performance. But again, consider speed, agility, and scale in the portfolio as really the driving principles behind some of these expectations and how they'll change. And then what has changed is really where they're going for help. So cloud continues to change everything in this regard, and we're seeing the value-added resellers and systems integrators and ISVs all reposition themselves as ecosystem partners that really play across what's happening in this world of hybrid cloud. The traditional infrastructure players and their partner ecosystems really need to move aggressively, and we see them doing this to make sure that they're not left behind, that they're part of this conversation as this digital infrastructure becomes more strategic and the conversations become more board level. So when we think about things like cloud security and data integration, they're really very much at the top of this transformation. They're really kind of front and center in terms of the considerations. It's important to consider the strategic areas of technology investment that are being made by enterprises. IDC continues to see cloud security and data management as critical underpinnings to the digital infrastructure. And this is really powering this transformation. But what's really most important to see here is what we expect to see change going forward. We fully expect to see investments in customer experience, in DevOps, in some of this social sentiment-based process orientation that will happen, in IoT and sensor-based technologies, new ways of informing digital processes and of bringing data streams into applications. And this will help drive enterprises towards, again, this continuum of maps and data. And we're going to see this infrastructure stretch out to include the edge as well. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through this as well. But it's important to think about an infrastructure that's stretching and elongating as this continuum really grows and becomes more important to how the operation of the business occurs. And of course, it means influencing and having conversations with different buying centers, and their personas are changing. So the IT ops folks are really increasingly finding themselves balancing the needs not only of the business folks that they've always worked with, but increasingly with developers. And while this isn't really entirely new, what is new is the expectations that both have on the IT operations. These folks want IT teams that support agility and portability in the business. They want to go faster. They want more and more resource moved towards a truly differentiated outcome for them. So just keep that in mind, that some of these conversations will get a bit more complex. There'll be more people in the room that we need to influence. And it's really about empowering the traditional IT ops folks that we know and have served so well with being able to have these conversations and support some of those needs. So where I'd like to go next is just a little bit of information that we're gathering from the users that we talk to, and we talked a little bit about buyer view earlier, but we want to talk about hybrid cloud and really, the cloud perspectives that the businesses are bringing to some of these decisions that are made around hybrid cloud. So when we think about something like digital transformation, we see it really accelerating at scale, as I've said. The IT landscape's being stretched well beyond the core and complexities rising. We know that we believe we'll see a roughly 50% increase in just the next 2 years in the application portfolio. We're doubling over 4 years. I said over the next 4 years, we'll see as many apps as in the previous 40. We know that about 60% of the new resource that will be deployed will be in service provider data centers or edge locations. So this could be hosting facilities, it could be cloud data centers, it could be teleco environments, it could be all of that, but also edge locations. So think about that as the the factory floor in a really intelligent manufacturing operation. In retail environments, it's into the stores, it's in stadiums, it's in hospitals, it's all of these places where we're going to see the intersection of infrastructure, apps, and data happening. It's also about the fact that about half of these applications will be built using cloud native frameworks, and there'll be componentization and containers and orchestration frameworks that will challenge the infrastructure teams in new ways. And then also, we see the level of expectations around interdependencies between these applications growing. So today, there are somewhere in the order of 4 to 8 dependencies that exist between enterprise applications. And as this IoT and social sentiment data, et cetera, become more important to the operation, so too will be the focus on improving data integration across all of this. So one of my mantras as an analyst is I've always liked to study the workloads and really start to think about what that means to some of these decisions. And we know that historically, not all workloads are created equal. But for years, we've studied this and we've pointed to workloads as really a critical area for technology suppliers and builders to understand. And the most important consideration is that they're not all created equal, as I said. We live in a hybrid world where we'll increasingly see a favor that of mix of public and private clouds, and that these private clouds will increasingly not live in a corporate-owned data center, but they'll be in hosted environments as more and more folks get out of the data center real estate business and focus on the technology, the apps and data as their point of differentiation. We also know that when it comes to the criticality of applications, enterprises are all over the map. So we see 20% of these applications as being kind of super critical, while other workloads can literally be out for days or weeks at a time without having a significant impact to the business. So again, kind of far from equal. And then when we think about location shifts, this is happening as well. So we see the remote and branch office and edge becoming a more and more prevalent component of decision making as the infrastructure chases the apps and the data to its point of creation. So when we think about this, so cloud has changed everything, and we know it's an operating model, but what we do see is already customers that are running a significant amount of multi-cloud and hybrid cloud already. You can see here that 90% or more are doing business with a couple of service providers, and they're also doing a lot of work on both the private and public cloud front, as you would imagine. And only 31% are working with a single cloud strategy. So that number will continue to go down. And this isn't even factoring in the SaaS component of a lot of the decision making that's happening out there. But the point here is we're pretty far along, but yet in some ways we're not, because we're really still at early stages in how we want to bring this all together. Today, it's happening kind of on a one-off basis based on the type of application that will fits best here or there. So we think that it's really important to differentiate what's really important. And when we listen to enterprise customers, we see the impact that's really on the kind of the broad enterprise cloud usage and what that's having on the underlying IT need. So we see customers' needs evolving as their cloud usage matures. And security, disaster recovery, backup and recovery, ease of management, availability management, these are all, in compliance and regulatory needs are all really rising to the top of a lot of the challenge that folks are feeling when they think about how they want to operate in this multi-cloud world. And another thing I think that a lot of us don't always think about is, no matter the lens that we use, cloud usage in the enterprise really is still very much in the early stages. So today, about 2/3 of all the cloud workload are really traditional applications that have been lifted and shifted or refactored and shifted to the cloud. Still, IDC, as I said, expects this number of applications will explode going forward, and many of these new applications will be built using cloud native, componentized technologies that really are intended to take full advantage of cloud capability. So we're going to see, more build for the cloud. And when I say cloud, that doesn't mean in the public cloud. That means it's going to live on this continuum that includes a lot of private cloud as well. So we take a little bit of a view under the hood here. One aspect of the cloud journey that's generally not told is really the rate of churn that we see in the market. And what this means is that workloads are moving in and out of these deployment environments all the time. And when I say deployment environment, it could be traditional IT, a hosted IT model, so on-prem, traditional, hosted off-prem. It could be on-prem private, it could be hosted private, it can be public. So all of that is in the mix as people think about this, including SaaS as well. And the interoperability requirements of modern applications are determining the appropriate landing zone. So in a way, I'm thinking of this as a kind of a new way or an updated way of talking about this notion of data gravity that we've talked about in the industry in the past, with edge and cloud native applications playing an increasingly big role in IT's decision making going forward. So here's just, it's a busy chart, but an example of what we mean when we talk about movement and churn. And to put a kind of a finer point on this, when we ask customers, we see a clear trend away from traditional IT and towards cloud as that operating model. And more, we believe that IT will live in provider data centers. So there'll be a lot more partners involved in this, including on the data center level. But the churn is really across all environments, and it's not a journey that happens in one way at all. It's really, when we use the word churn, we mean that we see applications moving in and out of all these environments. There are clear trends, but there are definitely new applications being built in traditional environments and applications being retired in traditional environments. The trend is away from traditional and towards this hybrid cloud model, but the reality is there's still a lot of new applications being built, moving in, moving out, and being retired across all of these different scenarios. And what we believe enterprises are looking for is a multi-cloud management consideration that really continues to be a theme across the enterprise today. They're looking to optimize, to monitor, and secure multiple clouds, and the three priorities of the enterprise. And IT suppliers need to understand that enterprises are looking to help when it comes to the performance monitoring, the cost management, the automation, and the capacity optimization in particular. And I know I'm going fast, but by all means, you'll have access to these slides if you want to, kind of pace through them at your own, pace later. The drivers for selection here are not really surprising. The notion of control plane continues to be a big area of focus for folks. And it's not only being exacerbated as clouds become more distributed, but also as they become more connected. And like we see with maturity or adoption, we also see dramatically different selection drivers emerging as users are looked to really kind of optimize the size and complexity of their environment for their specific needs. And it's important to consider that when touching these customers, as cross-cloud control plane perspectives are really not consistent, and they're not very well understood still today. So critical design points really do emerge for enterprise-ready cloud. And so in the world of what we refer to as future of digital infrastructure and multi-cloud, cloud architecture becomes a key consideration. We know that cloud architects, application teams, infrastructure teams, SREs, and DevOps all have a role in this decision-making. And we know that cloud centers of excellence are emerging to help focus on the optimization across these hybrid environments. But we also know that maturity matters. And what a lot of folks might not realize is that 47% of customers today have never run a production workload in the public cloud. So when we consider maturity, performance, security, and economics, they become increasingly critical, while things like disaster recovery, backup, ease of management, and compliance and regulatory considerations become somewhat less critical. So the point here is, as the point in the maturity curve begins to advance, as you work to the right of the slide, there are different motivations and there are different values that folks put on cloud. So let's take a quick look at the cloud landscape here to kind of bring this conversation through to the end. So IDC has been doing for the last couple of years what we refer to as a whole cloud forecast. And what we're trying to do here is consider cloud in the many ways to get there. So when we look at this at the perspective of kind of a vendor opportunity and customer spend, there are really focus areas up and down the technology stack. This view that I'm showing you here does not include SaaS. It's really largely focused on kind of the infrastructure layers here. I mean, SaaS to me is really a delivery model for software. But when you start to think about the hardware, software, and services opportunities that run across the infrastructure landscape, they are significant, and they're continuing to grow at a pretty dramatic rate. And we expect that this will continue throughout the economic challenge that we face as a result of COVID and the economic slowdown that's driving. So another way to think about this is there's this IT infrastructure redistribution happening. So the enterprise infrastructure market, and I mean hardware and software, infrastructure software as well as the hardware on here, is expected to grow at about 4.5% or so per year. But the deployments will change pretty dramatically as we go through this. So with cloud in mind, as infrastructure continues to redistribute, we'll see customers, their data center deployments decrease about 10 share points as the infrastructure and service provider hosted locations gain a bigger foothold. And as we do this, cloud will move from about half to almost 2/3 of all the spending over this exact same time frame. And COVID's having a very big near-term impact on IT spending patterns this year, and we expect with cloud, it's no exception. So in an economically challenged time like this, as I've said, customers tend to work to preserve cash. So what this has meant is in some cases, we'll see some deferrals in hardware investment. In fact, it's kind of an interesting pattern that we're seeing right now because we saw a refresh cycle. There's pent-up demand building for hardware refresh happening today. It was happening in late 2019 before COVID came along. And now with what we're experiencing in the market first half of this year, we think that will just press an even bigger refresh cycle into the second half of this year and certainly in 2021. So we're pretty bullish on what the market will look like and what the spending climate will look like for infrastructure in 2021 as early as Q4 of this year. But what this means is these deferred hardware investments really also look to change how people think about consumption. So consumption-based models will also gain some favor. So folks will look at ways to go from more of a CapEx intensive model around infrastructure, something that's more OpEx intensive, whether that infrastructure is in their own data centers, in service provider data centers. They're going to be looking for ways to become a little bit more tightly aligned between cash flow and revenue opportunities in their industry and in their business and how they actually pay for the underlying infrastructure. So IaaS is a growing portion of spend. Despite all the interest in SaaS applications in maybe what I would describe as less differentiated parts of the business, say like content and collaboration, infrastructure is really expected to become a larger part of cloud spending going forward. And this is really being driven by the fact that the intensity, the requirements of the infrastructure requirements and the intensity of the apps and data that enterprises are turning to differentiate in the market will drive this. So these workloads are extremely data rich and very much analytics focused. And so you're going to see a very different type of tuning of the infrastructure to really bring those analytics out and help feed that information into the business. So the center of gravity moves to cloud. And while cloud moves forward 2/3 of all infrastructure spending, we're about to hit a tipping point. So really what we expect to see here is traditional private cloud CapEx expenditures will begin to kind of back off, and we'll see more focus on some of these operationally intensive spends happening. And so that just means it's a different way of acquiring the infrastructure, but the law of large numbers will continue to weigh on this, and the public cloud will grow, but we expect to see growth across cloud, whether it's public or private, but clearly this hybrid notion is what we're looking at. So hybrid and multi-cloud usage grows. We believe that cloud research will continue to show a shift towards multiple cloud IaaS suppliers with more than 60% leveraging services from multiple providers today. But the sophistication of hybrid cloud usage is rising as well, with more than half of all the users that we're surveying stating that they're not only using a hybrid cloud, but that they'll leverage frameworks that select the optimal locations for each workload. So again, think about the landing zones I talked about, think about some of the churn we see in these applications, and also think about the interconnection points or interoperability requirements that's happening between these applications and this data. Nothing's living in isolation, and more of these things are being linked together, and that's influencing how people think about putting all of this together. So cloud services are expanding closer to customers. And of course, cloud services are really expanding and requiring a set of offerings that are aimed at capturing on this opportunity. These offerings represent both public and shared and private and dedicated options. And the battle here really is to influence and control the edge. And it's driving, as I mentioned earlier, a new partner ecosystem around that spans traditional IT, but also OT and CT, so the operational technologies that have not typically been the domain of the IT, kind of decision makers, as well as the communication technologies that we would think of as being provided by more of a kind of a carrier, a telco, and also the cloud service providers themselves. There's a battle here to build out these ecosystems and really drive and influence how this plays out. And I would just recommend that everyone that's paying attention here continue to watch this space. It's really going to influence, how we build new solutions and kind of who will drive some of these solutions into market and who will be best equipped to really monetize it and take advantage of these opportunities. So my kind of second to last slide before I close on a few summary points is to use just a couple of key infrastructure predictions to help illustrate the points that I've been making here in these comments. So edge, we believe that more than 50% of new infrastructure will be deployed in critical edge locations, up from 10% today. So that's a pretty dramatic shift over the next 4 or 5 years that we would expect to see. And again, it gets back to the comments I just made about the IT and the OT and the CT worlds increasingly becoming more and more dependent on one another. Workloads, 80% of the workloads will shift or be created with microservices. And this will actually reduce some of the per app infrastructure needs by up to 60% as we look to drive much better application resiliency. So again, if you're going to have a doubling of the number of applications in the next 4 years, you're not going to have a doubling of the infrastructure, but certainly it's going to pressure and put a lot of new context on what that infrastructure needs to do and what it needs to be optimized to do. Customization, 40% of enterprises will take advantage of hyper-customized in-memory data and increasingly heterogeneous computing to reduce the time to embed AI into business processes. This just means a single tool is not going to be the right solution here. There's going to be a lot of optimization for these workloads, and that, of course, creates opportunity for anybody supplying in this market, but it's also going to change a lot of the buying criteria from the customers as well. I've talked a bit about flex consumption. We think that about 75% of infrastructure at edge will be consumed and or operated via an as-a-service model. So we're going to see a lot more managed services emerge here, and we're going to see more, OpEx payment models associated with this. And a lot of this will be driven by the fact that there's just less ability to do some good, effective capacity forecasting requirement here, and there'll be a desire to kind of pass on some of that risk to suppliers. People understand data center requirements; they don't understand edge requirements. And then final point here is really around these interdependencies. 40% of enterprise data center spend will focus on running apps that need reliable, secure interconnects to third-party resources in cloud or co-location facilities. So we're going to see the intersection of a lot of things happening in this hybrid world, and that's going to drive, and these interdependencies will drive a lot of that. Okay, so just to wrap up on this, we believe that the pandemic has changed everything. The next normal will be highly digital and hybrid in nature, and it'll be the basis for business disruption in this new economic cycle that will come out on the back end of this. The edge will stretch and stress infrastructures in new ways. We'll see unprecedented scale requirements and shifts in computing and storage and networking loads, and this will accelerate the need towards more automation. So the customer experience changes, and this really becomes the basis of a lot of this change that's happening. And the way we think of it is really that this is frictionless connectivity. These are frictionless deployments, and we need frictionless operations to really stand this up and operate at a level of augmentation beyond what we're capable of doing as humans alone. So a much more of an intersection between the intelligence and the infrastructure with a different type of operator that's actually going to drive a lot of this. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for your time today, and I wish you only the best in the weeks and the months ahead. And I hope this presentation proves helpful. And certainly, I'm going to push this back to Bo and welcome questions now. And as Bo said, if we don't get them to today, we'll do it. Happy to do them offline as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass this back to you, Bo.
Yeah, Matt, thank you very much. That was awesome. I took about 3 pages of notes, so I appreciate it. I think you summed up all the change that we're seeing with our clients every day, and it's interesting to kind of see where you think things we're going to be going here. So I think we probably have about 6 minutes or so for some questions, and then we're going to have Lauren come on and do a couple of raffle prizes here at the end. One of the questions that came in is regarding the drivers behind the multi-cloud strategy. Are you seeing organizations testing the waters or strategically allocating applications to individual or specific cloud service providers?
That's a good question. I mean, today there's still so much work that needs to be done kind of to make multi-cloud a reality for folks. I think there's definitely some testing going on, but I would think most organizations, the vast majority of organizations today that are operating in multiple clouds are doing it in a very deliberate manner. They're doing it based on applications that fit best here or there, or the decisions were made by somewhat different parts of an organization as well. Ultimately, we think of this, kind of world of nirvana where we can move things around, freely, but that's really not how folks are operating today. I think we've still got a long way to go with some of the tooling and just even some of the organizational models that need to be put in place to support something like that.
And, based on your last comment there, this question kind of seems to be adjacent to how you just even answered that. One of the questions was, our organization seems to only focus on cost cutting or cost optimization. How would you recommend we get our teams and others to think differently to realize this might be our chance to actually invest and go innovate more?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important too, because one of the things that we've helped our customers do, and I think Evolving Solutions has been in the middle of this as well, is we're really good at helping our business customers get more efficient with how they deploy technology. So we've moved from higher cost technologies to lower cost technologies. We've introduced a lot more sharing of infrastructure as we've virtualized and now moved into more cloud environments. But if you think about it, there's a limit to how far you can push that. And I think we're very much there. As this world's become a bit more ubiquitous and a bit more homogeneous, what I'm very much saying is I think the world ahead of us becomes a bit more complicated and a bit more differentiated in terms of more heterogeneity on the back end. And so people are going to have to think differently about this. And so to get to the specific question, I would just say it's really just doing some better benchmarking with peers, and certainly we can help with that. I think there's a lot of desire to we've always said in my entire 20 years as an analyst that the money's kind of flowing up into higher value propositions, and as the infrastructure guy at IDC, I never want to be dismissive of the importance of infrastructure. What I'm saying now is that infrastructure is critical, and we all need to be telling the story about the strategic value of an infrastructure to that C-suite, so they understand that there's no free pass here. If they truly want to be digital, this is something that requires investment. So I don't have an easy, simple answer here, but I think it's all of us helping to communicate that and tell that story, so that the folks that are implementing these solutions in this infrastructure have that air support from senior level folks and understand that, hey, this isn't just about adding a new room on the house. This is about taking a very fundamentally different approach to how you build and operate an infrastructure to support a fully digital business.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And this next one is going to be a twofer for you. Just had a question come in and had one come in earlier in one of your slides. So I'm going to try and combine them here. What percentage of organizations have defined enterprise-wide cloud-first strategies, or is the growth of cloud happening more organically? And the other question that kind of relates to that earlier was, it seemed to be a trend that organizations were creating cloud teams. Is that still continuing, or do you see them skilling up differently to be able to support the hybrid cloud world?
Sure. I mean,
So
I
it's
think
kind of going tandem there.
Yeah, I mean, initially, I would tend to agree that a lot of the initial. So one thing I would just say, put out there right out front is, when people look at how much infrastructure is being delivered through public clouds and the growth rates and whatnot, it is important to understand that most of that is not what I would describe as enterprise workload. You know, you have this mobile revolution that's been happening, a lot of consumer-oriented hosting that's happening there, and then you have a lot of ISVs that are SaaSifying on these platforms. But having said that, I think most of the initial rotation to cloud by enterprises was really done in the form of what I would describe as shadow IT. It was not a coordinated, highly organized approach. It was more, kind of scattered. It was very project specific, and it was very much focused on things like mobile engagement. I do think that as the cloud landscape gets more complicated and as the usage models get more complicated, we definitely see a move towards these, we saw cloud centers of excellence and site reliability engineers, but we definitely see, well, the centers of excellence are really the one that's emerging now, and the folks that are furthest along that maturity curve are more likely to be thinking that way. And so that's bringing a different type of thinking across the whole IT organization that's trying to bring more consistency to the decision making. And I think that's probably, for all of us, that's our friend. We want more of a predictable, consistent set of decision making, and not people doing things because it fits the moment or it fits their need.
Makes sense. And Lauren, if you want to come back on here real quick, I'm going to ask Matt we have about 6 questions left. I'm just going to probably have time for one more here. Have you seen an increase in security incidents since the beginning of the onset of COVID?
Oh yeah, and security, in all of our surveys, security was the most intense focus area for folks. I mean, as you go, again, I talked about edge in the context of how infrastructure moves, but when you move people, out of these central locations and you're running across a very distributed landscape, we've definitely seen a number of security considerations arise. That I think that's one of the areas that people are going to have to go back and take a look at some of their new, kind of technical debt that they've developed, and whether or not that was the right model, because it may have exposed them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I was on a client call this morning, and massive deployment to VDI overnight,
yeah.
And now they're saying, what's next, right? Like, let's focus on, we did this so quick,
exactly.
And we're engaging with, like, what's next, right? So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Matt, thank you again. We really appreciate it. And I want to bring on Lauren here real quick. And Lauren, you want to maybe offer up our raffle winners for today, and then kind of give some logistics on how we're going to circle back with folks.
Perfect. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Our raffle winners for today were Ron Schmidt, Greg Kimbrough, and Scott Jacobs. And I will reach out to you after the webinar today and ship those items to you. For everybody that's still on, if you'd like to join us at our upcoming events, visit us at evolvingsoul.com/events.
Awesome.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, so Lauren, thank you, and congratulations to our winners. Matt, we really do appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing all that information. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. If we did not get a chance to answer your question, we'll circle back by email with you to make sure we answer those questions as well. And then probably by the end of this week, Matt's replay and charts will be distributed by Lauren to everyone, and they'll also be out on the Evolving Solutions YouTube channel. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody.